Okay, we're looking at, again, Perek Chamishi. Again, Perek Chamishi is actually a very, very hard chapter, and it may be that we will not be able to fully exhaust at least the Kabbalistic subtleties of it. But remember, last week we were just simply focusing on the very first Yesod that the Ramak says, which is actually a surprising Yesod, that the foundation of the chesed we show to others is based on the unconditional love that we have for Hashem, which means to say it's the love of Hashem that causes us to do chesed to others. And we spoke last week about the chiddush of that. He then goes on to elaborate a little bit more and points out that loving Hashem means that you accept that whatever HaKadosh Baruch Hu does to you is for your good. In other words, whether it's what's called a midah taiva or a midah ra, and this, of course, is the Mishnah in Maseches Brachos, the last Mishnah in Brachos. Chayav Adam levarech al hara'a kederech shemavarech al hatova, that a person is obligated to make a blessing for bad things, just as he makes a blessing for good things. And the Gemara explains that does not mean it is the same bracha, because for good things you make a shechiyanu or toiva hametiv. For bad things, a tragedy, a bereavement, you make dayana emes. So what does it mean? The same way you make a bracha for the good, you make a bracha for the bad. So the Gemara explains the brachos are going to be different, but in both you accept them with a sense of simcha, you accept them with a sense of joy. Now even there you have to understand it a little bit more. The Gemara does not mean that the joy for good news is the same as the joy for bad news. Obviously, you're not going to dance at the table when one hears that their parents passed away. I mean, that's not the concept. And fakert, the very fact that there is a different bracha for good and bad indicates that the feelings are supposed to be different. But you have to understand the statement, you have to be makabel b'simcha. Simcha itself has differential ways of expressing it. There is a simcha that is exuberant. There is a simcha that involves singing and dancing and outwardly rejoicing. And then there is a simcha that can be accompanied with a great deal of soberness and even sadness. But it's an inner simcha that ultimately I know that Hashem has not rejected me, and ultimately everything is for the good. So the Gemara's statement that in both you have to be makabel b'simcha does not mean that you're makabel with the same simcha, but the notion of serenity, that I know there's a gamzu l'toiva in whatever HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives. These are the famous stories. Rabbi Akiva, Kol ma diavad Rachmana l'tavavid, whatever Hashem does is for good, and Nocham ish gamzu, a Tana who was called Gamzu. Actually, Gamzu is the name of a village, but he was called Gamzu also because he always said Gamzu l'taiva. And this is derived, the Gemara has a number of psukim to prove this point. One is that this is the meaning of Kriya Shema. V'yahavta es Hashem aleikecha, you should love Hashem b'chol levavcha, with all of your heart, u'v'chol nafshecha, with all of your soul, u'v'chol ma'idecha is typically translated with all of your might, but that doesn't really say what it means. So Rashi brings, really from the Gemara itself, that there are two explanations in what does it mean. Well, let's go over each one just because it's Kriya Shema after all. So we say it twice a day, or some say 3 times a day, some say 4 times a day, because some people in Korbanos will actually say at least the first paragraph of Shema, and some even say all 3 paragraphs of Shema, although that's rare. So we have Korbanos, and then we have Kriya Shema of Shachris, and then we have Kriya Shema of Arvis, and then we have Kriya Shema al Hamita. So Kriya Shema you say between 3 and 4 times. So it's always kedai to know exactly what you're saying. You shall love Hashem with all of your heart. So first, Rashi points out that it doesn't say b'chol libecha, but levav. Levav is another form of heart, but note the extra vase. B'chol levavacha. So Rashi says that means you should serve Hashem with both of your inclinations. You should serve Hashem with your Yetzer Tov, and you should serve Hashem with your Yetzer Hara. Serve Hashem with both of your hearts, the Tov and the Ra. So what does that mean? I understand how I serve Hashem with my Yetzer Tov. How do I serve Hashem with my Yetzer Hara? Fakert, my Yetzer Hara is that which rebels against Hashem. So there are two explanations that the Meforshim give. One explanation is you serve Hashem with your Yetzer Hara by not giving in to the Yetzer Hara. So the Yetzer Hara is there, so to speak. So you will be misgaber over the Yetzer Hara, and therefore the Yetzer Hara is part of your avodas Hashem. If I didn't have a Yetzer Hara, then my not giving in to the Yetzer Hara would be meaningless. It wouldn't mean anything because there's no Yetzer Hara. So therefore, I am serving God with my Yetzer Hara by fighting the Yetzer that's pulling me in the wrong direction. That's pshat number one. Pshat number two is the idea that a person should do Torah and mitzvahs even shelo lishma, even if it's not for the sake of God, because mitoch shelo lishma, by doing these things not for the sake of God, you eventually come lishma. So, for example, a person might learn for kavod. Well, a person might learn because they're scared they'll get kicked out of yeshiva or their parents will be angry. Or a person learns so people will think how smart he is. Right? So it's not l'shem shamayim, it's not lishma. But nevertheless, mitoch shelo lishma ba lishma, meaning to say, I'm using my Yetzer Hara for kavod and recognition to do good things. Right? In fact, Rav Chaim Volozhiner writes that some Hasidim, he never mentions Hasidim, but he's talking about that, had the attitude that if you're learning Torah because of kavod and because of recognition, your Torah learning is worthless, you shouldn't learn at all. Rav Chaim Volozhiner was extremely negative about that. He said, listen, obviously learning Lishma is infinitely better than learning not Lishma. But by the same token, learning not Lishma is infinitely better than not learning at all. So in such a situation, you should use your Yetzer Hara to be a motivator. Right? So that's the first shot. You serve God with both of your Yetzer, your Yetzer Tov, and your Yetzer Hara, either by fighting the Yetzer Hara when that's appropriate, or by utilizing the Yetzer Hara itself as a motivator in avodas Hashem, based on the idea of mitoch shelo lishma ba lishma, that eventually the shelo lishma brings you to a level of lishma because the Torah purifies you. Okay, so that's b'chol levavecha. We then get to b'chol nafshecha. So here Rashi says this means you must even give up your life to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Be willing to give up your life. Now we know that halachically this does not apply in all situations. Most of the time, when your life is in danger, the halacha is you violate the Torah. Technically it's not a violation. You violate Shabbos, you violate kashrus. I mean, it's not a violation because basically you have to preserve your life. But there are circumstances where a person must be willing to die. And the one that this is referring to specifically this is actually the halachic source, that a person must give up their life before they worship avodah zarah. That if the guy goes over to me and says, bow down to this idol, convert to my religion or I will kill you, you are mechuyev to let yourself be killed rather than renounce Hashem, because that's what it means. You must love God with all of your nefesh, even if He takes away your nefesh. So this, unlike b'chol levavcha, which is universal, b'chol nafshecha is not universal because in most situations you're not mechuyev to give up your life, but sometimes you are. Now this does raise some interesting questions. Again, I can speak hours and hours about this. I don't want to get too far afield. Issue number one, I think we discussed this a long time ago, that the Rambam has a letter, it's not in the Mishnah Torah, in which people in Yemen, this is the famous Igeres Teiman, people in Yemen were undergoing Islamic persecution. And the Islamic persecution was very pro forma. They basically had a bunch of, it seems to me, it was a bunch of teenagers. I don't have the exact number or age, that they were going around putting a knife to your neck saying, do you accept Muhammad, or whatever it is. And they had to have a certain quota, like police giving tickets. So all you had to say was, whatever the formula is, Muhammad is his prophet, etc. And then they would leave you alone, and you could do Torah, you could do mitzvahs, you can go to shul. You just had to make this declaration, or they would kill you. So a lot of Jews went along. They remained religious. They weren't even Morados. They didn't even have to hide. They could keep the Torah openly, but they had to make this statement, or their throat would get slit. So they were told by a rabbi in Yemen that you are now goyim in God's eyes, that any mitzvahs you do are repulsive to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore you are not Jewish anymore, and your mitzvahs are just an abomination. So they were heartbroken, because these were Jews who wanted to keep the Torah, and they were told that, they're goyim. And they asked the Rambam. So the first part of the letter is quite amazing. I would hate to be on the receiving end of the Rambam. The Rambam had such anger, burning, fiery anger towards this rabbi that said, how dare, he tell people that? And the Rambam makes a very important point. The Rambam makes the point that when, and this he does say in the Mishnah Torah too, that even when there is a chiyuv to give up your life, if you fail to fulfill that chiyuv, so you haven't done that mitzvah, but you are still considered to have acted under duress. Meaning, it's a very interesting point. Meaning, if I bow down to an idol, because I'm told if I don't do that, they're going to kill me, I'm mechuyev to die. But if I bow down because I don't want to be killed, I am an onus. I am considered to have acted under coercion, and I am still a member of the Jewish community in good standing. That was the first point that the Rambam made, that how dare you compare a person who acted out of fear of death, even though he was mechuyev to give up his life, with somebody who commits sins without a fear of death. Okay, that's the first point. Now that point is not so controversial, because that is in the Mishnah Torah itself. The Rambam actually paskins that way, la halacha. The second point, though, is a little tricky. The second point is the Rambam seems to imply, although he's never really clear, that it's not only after the fact they are still accepted as Jews, but the Rambam suggests they might have been permitted to make the statement in order to save their lives. That's a very different point. That's not simply saying after the fact they're called anusim. Okay, that point is in the Mishnah Torah. But even lechatchila, they could make the statement, I believe in, Muhammad, his prophet. And the Rambam seems to give two reasons. It's a very ambiguous text. One reason he gives is that since everybody knows you don't mean it, even the teenagers know you don't really mean it. It's just a way of getting their quota. So if the guy knows you don't really mean to renounce your God and renounce the Torah, then it's not called a renunciation. Just like the old story, something is not a lie if everybody knows you're a liar. Right? A lie is when you're fooling somebody by not telling the truth. If everybody knows it's a lie, so you're not deceiving anybody. So here the Rambam seems to learn that the prohibition, or the chiyuv of Mesiras Nefesh, is to prevent the non-Jews from thinking you are rejecting God. When it's very, very clear that you're not rejecting God, when it's very clear that it's fake, when it's very clear that you don't mean it, there is no chiyuv to give up your life. Now, the emes is, that's an extremely difficult svara for a very simple reason. Every time somebody says to me, bow down to the idol or I'll kill you, by definition, they know that you're only doing it to save your life. They're not going to think, oh, at this moment you have a sincere conversion to Christianity. So the hechrich, isn't it mukhrich, that the chiyuv of Mesiras Nefesh is, even if they know you don't mean it. That's the whole point. You can't even profess it. So, but nevertheless, the Rambam seems to suggest that at least a profession of faith that is understood not to be sincere does not require a Mesiras Nefesh. That's Chiddush number one. Chiddush number 2 is an alternative ground. Since Islam is a monotheistic religion, it is bichlal not avodah zarah, and therefore a Jew does not have to give up his life to avoid profession of faith in Islam, because it is not avodah zarah bichlal. Now that too is a tremendous, tremendous chiddush, because although it is true, it is indeed the case that Islam is not avodah zarah, but at a minimum, it is a denial in the immutability of the Torah and the finality of Moshe Rabbeinu's prophecy. So the Rambam must be saying you don't have to give up your life for that, which is another question. Now, so the point I'm making is, the Rambam in Igeres Teiman makes 3 points, one of which is in the Mishnah Torah, actually codified as halacha. The other 2 points are in the letter, but they're not codified in the Mishnah Torah. Point number 1 is that even when there's a chiyuv to give your life, if you fail in fulfillment of that chiyuv, you committed a sin, but you're still a Jew in good standing, you're counted for a minyan, you could be regarded as a righteous person. That is indeed a beferish halacha that the Rambam brings in the Mishnah Torah, which distinguishes between the chiyuv to give up your life before the fact and the after the fact consequences. Okay, that's fine. The second point, however, 2 and 3 are the justifications that he offers why even lechatchila they are permitted to profess allegiance to Islam. Point number 1 is because everybody knows it's a joke and was not sincere. And point number 2 is Islam is not avodah zarah for the chiyuv of Mesiras Nefesh, unlike Christianity and the like. Neither of those points are brought down in the halacha in the Mishnah Torah. Yeah, the Rambam does say Islam is not avodah zarah, but he doesn't say it in connection with not having to give up your life. So you can't just take the general statement. And many have said that, okay, it's always hard to say this, that the Rambam actually didn't mean what he said as a final halacha. He was trying to offer comfort to a broken population, so he mentions some svaras that would give them some sense that maybe they didn't commit such a real sin. But when push comes to shove, halacha l'maisa, they were mechuyev to give up their lives. So that's a whole question whether these statements in Igeres Teiman are to be taken as halacha psuka, or are they in the nature of comfort to a broken population. But be it as it may, I'm just digressing here because really we're just trying to interpret Shema, and really for purposes of the Ramak, it's the third expression. Okay, just be sure you're not losing me here. Meaning the Ramak is going to go into B'chol Ma'odecha, but as an Agav, the Agav, I wanted to briefly explain B'chol Levavacha U'B'chol Nafshecha. Now, one other issue about B'chol Nafshecha that's very fascinating is a distinction that some poskim draw between impersonation versus repudiation. Let's take the Holocaust itself. Is a Jew allowed to disguise themselves as a Christian? Can a Jew say, I'm a Christian? Now this would be relevant if, Nazis, you're going through checkpoints, etc. You're being smuggled out, and Jews would be sometimes dressed even as priests, even with a crucifix or whatever it would be. Are you allowed, in other words, if you're going to be killed if you're a Jew, but if you dress up as a Christian, or you pass yourself off as a Christian, or you declare that you're a Christian, maybe they'll believe you, and you have false papers, a false passport. Or as the argument is, that since Christianity is idolatry for a Jew, and that for sure is the case, I'm mechuyev to give up my life. I cannot say I'm a Christian. If they're going to kill me, they're going to kill me. So some poskim, this unfortunately was not a theoretical question, this was halacha l'maisa. Some poskim have differentiated between impersonating a guy versus converting to be a guy, meaning the following. The paradigmatic case of Kiddush Hashem is where the guy knows you're a Jew, he knows you're a Jew, but says, accept Yashka or I'll kill you. So there, I am obligated to give up my life rather than repudiate my Judaism. Right? That's the halacha of Yehareg Val Yavar. Now, in Nazi Germany, that bedafka would not have saved you. If you were to say, I'm a Jew, but I convert to Christianity, even if you were sincere, that's not going to save you. There were actually Jews who did convert to Christianity who died in the concentration camps. So in order to save yourself, you're not saying, I'm a Jew and I reject Judaism. You're simply impersonating. You're saying, I'm not a Jew. I was born a Christian. Now, even though your gut reaction might be, that's even worse, in point of fact, some poskim say that's better because you're simply covering up your identity, meaning you're not making a declaration of repudiation of Judaism. You're simply saying you were never Jewish. So some poskim actually did permit impersonation of a Jew to be a Gentile, even though they would say, to say you're converting out of Judaism would be Yehareg Val Yavar because you're repudiating Hashem, but to simply say you're somebody else is not the same thing. So they did permit it. Other poskim drew a very strange distinction, which is more of a verbal game. And verbal games are never really that comfortable, in which you were allowed to respond to a German. Now, the German asks you, are you Jewish? Why he would believe you, I don't know. But you're asked, are you Jewish? So you could say, Ken Yid. Now, Ken Yid, in Hebrew, Cain, yes, I'm a Jew. In German, as well as Yiddish, Ken Yid means there is no Jew here. So you could use a verbal formula in which you intend one thing and they understand it a different way. Why those things work is never very, very clear to me either. But some would only allow it under those circumstances, which it actually would mean that a clear, unequivocal statement, I am a Christian, would be a Yehareg Val Yavar. But as I say, many poskim, in fact, do allow impersonations. You hear the chiluk between what you might call renunciation of my Judaism versus impersonation of a false identity. Yeah.
How about the Jewish parents who gave over their babies to the Christian families, which would grow up as Christian? Is the halacha better that the baby dies, or? Yeah, that's a very, very good question. So I give my child over to be raised as a Christian. Now they're going to be raised as a Christian, but the answer might be, the heter might be, that because they are katanim, they're not obligated to give up their lives, and therefore I'm allowed to have my child live because he's not yet mechuyev in mitzvahs. Now, technically, if he would have been 13-year-old, it could very well be I wouldn't have been allowed to do that. But as a katan, the katan himself is not mitzvah in that kiddush Hashem. Yeah.
Might we say there's a fourth category that one has to give up their life, which is, I think Chazal says, better to throw oneself in a fiery furnace than to commit a chilul Hashem. If one's, in the case of Islam, let's say you're not going to Zara, but you're rejecting the final sea of Moshe's Nevuah, is that chilul Hashem and one better to die than say that?
Well, I think that is a very good argument, which lahalacha we would actually, in other words, that's yet another problem with the Rambam's formulation. Right, the Rambam seems to say once it's not within the narrow confines of Avodah Zarah, you're not mechuyev to give up your life. But you're correct, denying the permanency of the Torah and the primacy of Moshe Rabbeinu's prophecy is a chilul Hashem. So that's why I indicated. Some say that the Rambam was not giving a halachic judgment on that, and indeed in the Mishnah Torah, there is no such statement. By the way, just a little biographical aside. The Rambam had many enemies in his lifetime, so hate mail and the like was not a unique 21st century phenomenon, not the only one. But ad kedei kach, that rumors were spread that in the Rambam's youth he himself gave in to one of these conversions. And they said the Rambam was technically a Muslim. Now, once again, you understand what happened. The way slander works is they take the Igeres Teiman, in which the Rambam was trying to be Molamed Zechus on the people who did what they did, and they said, aha, that's what he did. And therefore they wanted to say that, right? So they turned his Limud Zechus into a kitrig against him. And he actually had to write. He had to write to dispel the accusations. He was actually accused of formally converting to Islam. In fact, I believe that they made it even worse. It wasn't even to save his life; it was to get a job or something. I mean, his life wasn't even in danger. But he said he did it because he got a better job. That's how he got into the Sultan. Because remember, the Rambam had a very good job. He hated it because it took him away from Torah learning. It's not like he loved it, but the Rambam was the doctor to the Sultan or the Caliph in Cairo, and this was a huge palace that had hundreds and hundreds of people in the royal palace, and the Rambam was the doctor for the entire palace. So the Rambam had hundreds of patients that he had to see in the course of the day. Now he hated it because it took away his time from learning and everything else, but Lamaisa, I assume he got well paid. It was a very prestigious job, and one of the rumors was he got the job because he became a Muslim. So he actually had to defend himself against that accusation. I'm sorry, someone had a hand up? Yeah.
I was just wondering, how could someone even say that if someone converts that they're no longer Jewish? If a Jew still, even if a Jew converts, wouldn't he still be a Jew?
Yes, that's correct. In fact, you're 100% correct. That's yet another point, meaning even if they intentionally worshipped idols, let's assume their life wasn't threatened and they just decided to become a Christian or a pagan, they're still Jewish. I mean, this rabbi was totally wrong. I mean, and the Rambam really lambasted him. And the Rambam talked about how even Moshe Rabbeinu, when he says bad things about the Jewish people, Hashem removes him. How dare this person, say bad things about Klal Yisrael? You could really get. I mean, you're almost scared to read it. Like you feel like the Rambam is yelling at you. Very, very, very strong, harsh words. Yeah.
In worst case scenario, even if they weren't allowed to do it, can they just do tshuva and now get over that?
Of course. Even Avodah Zarah has tshuva. A person decided to become an idol worshiper. He does tshuva. Hashem forgives him. There may have to be suffering. There may be purification that's needed, but ultimately Hashem forgives him. There is no sin for which HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not forgive. There was a story of Ari Levin. Rav Ari Levin, who was Rav Yosef's father-in-law, was known as the Tzaddik of Yerushalayim, and he was known as the Rav of the prisoners, because in the years before 1948, when Israel was under the British mandate, and in those years, in the 40s, particularly after World War II, there was a lot of stuff. A lot of Jews were in prison for fighting against the British, for terrorist activities, the famous bombing of the King David Hotel. Of course, even then, they were given warning to evacuate. I mean, the British were told to evacuate the hotel and everything else, but the hotel got blown up. The King David Hotel is still there. And a lot of Jews were imprisoned, and Rav Ari Levin used to spend hours and hours, sometimes Shabbases, in prison with these people. Most of them were not religious at all. Most of them were not from it all. But he gave them chizuk and the like. But in one particular case, there was a Jew who had killed another Jew. In other words, he was not a political prisoner. He had actually murdered another Jew. And he was so heartbroken. He was heartbroken. He did it because he lost his temper uncontrollably, and sometimes, God forbid, you never know what could happen to a person if they really lose it. But afterwards, he was so despondent, he became basically catatonic. He couldn't function at all, that he had murdered somebody, the enormity of it. And Rav Ari Levin spoke to him, and he said, listen, murder is like the worst of all sins. But there is still tshuva, and you turn to Hashem, and you do the mitzvahs that you can. And you have to know that on some level, you will make peace with God, and on some level, you'll have to suffer because you did take a life. So life will have its sufferings, and Gehenna will also have its claim against you. But ultimately, your tshuva will be accepted by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And Rav Ari Levin made the point that if one person was murdered, that doesn't automatically mean that you murder the other person, meaning to say a life should not be destroyed. You have to make the best of your life, even under those tragic circumstances. So you're correct, tshuva is certainly there. Okay, so now we come to the third one. You should love Hashem with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your might. And that's the one the Ramak talks about. So what does it mean with all of your might? So Rashi gives two pshatim. Pshat number one is ma'od means all of your possessions or all of your money. You must serve God with all of your money. So this would mean if a non-Jew comes over to you and says, worship Avodah Zarah or I'll take all your money, you must be willing to give up all of your money and live in poverty. So Rashi raises the obvious question. If I already know you're mechuyev to give your life, then kal v'chomer, you have to give up your money. If I have to give up my money. So, I always remind people, famous radio show, Jack Benny. I don't know if you have even heard of Jack Benny, but one of the Gedolim of comedy, a Jewish, happens to be Jewish, although unfortunately intermarried. That Jack Benny, although he was personally actually generous, but his persona was, he was stingy. That was his character. So before he was on television, he was a big radio star on the radio show. So he, in one of the skits in the 1930s or 40s, he's held up in Central Park by a mugger. And the old line used to be, your money or your life. And then there's a 30-second pause. In radio, that is enormous. 30 seconds. And he says, I'm thinking about it. And this is exactly, maybe Jack Benny learned this Rashi. Rashi says, some people value their money more than their lives. So if they had to give up their life, they'll say sure. If they have to give up their money, they'll say no. Therefore, the Torah has to say, not only must you give up your life, you have to be willing to give up your money, because the money is chaviv alav migufay. Now you might say, that's ridiculous. What type of idiot would have that thought? But the answer is it's not so ridiculous, because a person might be worried about his family. A person might take the position that, okay, if I die, I die, but at least I can leave things for my family to be supported. If they take all my money, I'll have no way of supporting my family. This is why people get life insurance and commit suicide. And that's why life insurance policies have anti-suicide forfeiture clauses. Because people might get $1 million life insurance policy, then kill themselves, so their family gets $1 million. So there is a cheshbon that money might be more important to a person than their life. Now, I'll just mention the kasha I have. I have a kasha that I don't understand Chazal's kasha. In other words, Chazal are asking, if I already know you're mechuyev to give up your life, why does the Torah have to tell me you have to give up your money, right? If you have to give up your life, then of course you have to give up your money. My question is this, well, wait a second, that's not really true. Because you're obligated to give up your money even when you don't have to give up your life. For example, if a guy goes over to me, but I'm using guy, I don't mean to denigrate non-Jews in particular, but usually the oppressor in these cases will tend to be a non-Jew. If a non-Jew goes over to me and says, desecrate Shabbos or I'll kill you, I'm allowed to desecrate Shabbos. If a guy says, desecrate Shabbos or I'll take away every single thing you own, I am obligated to give up every single thing I own. So, b'chol ma'odecha is not superfluous. Ein achinami, there are a few cases where I have to give up my life. But even if I don't have to give up my life, I'm going to have to give up my money for Shabbos, for kashrus, and the like. So, b'chol ma'odecha is not superfluous. If b'chol ma'odecha would only apply when you have to give up your life, then you could ask the kasha, once I have to give up my life, then kal v'chomer my money, and you're going to have to answer, some people care more about their money than their lives. But if b'chol ma'odecha is broader than b'chol nafshecha, then b'chlal it's not a kasha. Okay, but that's pshat, okay, that's something you think about. That is pshat number one. Pshat number two in ma'odecha, pshat number two, and this is where the Talmud Devorah is going to focus, is ma'od does not mean your possessions, but ma'od means midah. Whatever characteristic or whatever measuring cup Hashem has given you, whether it's good or bad, you should love Him and know that it comes for your good. V'chol midah u'midah shehu moded lecha. And that's what the Ramak says, that your love of God should encompass that even when difficult things come to me, I know that they're for my good, and my love for Hashem is not diminished. Right? Normally, if someone does things that we look at as bad, I tend not to like them. And here, my love of God is so unconditional that I understand that everything is for the good. So, with all of this long digression, one makor for the idea of accepting what you think is bad and loving Hashem in spite of it is b'chol mo'odecha. Another is from Bikurim. It says by Bikurim, v'samachta b'chol hatov, you shall rejoice in all of the good, asher nasan lecha Hashem Elokecha, that Hashem Elokecha has given you. Hashem is Yud Kei Vav Kei. That's the name of Rachamim. Elokecha is Elokim, is Midas Hadin, meaning whether you get something from Hashem, Rachamim, or whether you get something from Elokim, b'samachta b'chol hatov, you should have simcha in the good that Hashem is giving you, right? So that's another source for chayav adam levarech al hara, kederech shemavarech al hatova. It's a limud from Bikurim. Now the emes is, the Kli Yakar says that you can actually get this message not only in B'chol Mo'odecha, you actually get the message in Shema itself. Look at the first pasuk. Shema Yisrael, listen, hear. Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Hashem Elokeinu. Hashem is Yud Kei Vav Kei, Rachamim. Elokeinu is Din, Elokim Shalanu. From our perspective, we sometimes see the God of mercy, and we sometimes see the God of punishment. Hashem Echad, it ultimately comes from Rachamim. The Din itself is Rachamim. Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And that is also the meaning at the end of Aleinu, which is a pasuk in Zechariah. V'haya Hashem lamelech al kol haaretz. Hashem, when Mashiach comes, will be the melech in all of the world. B'yayim ahu, on that great day of redemption, Yiyah Hashem echad. God will be one. Ushemo echad, and His name will be one. So the Gemara asks, what do you mean God will be one? God is one right now. God was never not one. The answer is, in this world, it's as if there are two gods, because we sometimes perceive kindness and benevolence, and we sometimes perceive suffering and punishment. So it looks like there are two gods. Liyasid lava, we will understand that even the din is actually rachamim. And that's what it means. Shemo echad, in other words, it looks like two gods because we have two names, Hashem and Elokim. Liyasid lava, we will understand that even the din is rachamim. Okay? And the Ramak says, if one loves Hashem, one has that understanding even in this world. And v'yahavta es Hashem Elokecha, right? Hashem Elokecha mirrors Hashem Elokeinu. You shall love both the Hashem, Yud Kei Vav Kei, and the Elokecha, which is Midas Hadin. Okay, and that's the notion of understanding Kol Ma De'avid Rachmana L'Tav. Now that doesn't mean it'll be easy, and that doesn't mean it'll be pleasant, and that doesn't mean it'll be fun, but it means it is ultimately for the good. Even if in the short term, we don't always see that. Okay, so this is really an elaboration on the idea of Avas Hashem is the unconditional understanding that whatever Hashem gives me is ultimately for my good. Okay, we'll stop it.
Thank you for listening to this Awesome Ech production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.